Hello, students of class 7. I hope you're all doing good by the grace of God. So, I welcome you all back to our English class. So, today we will be looking at the encounter of the king with the grandfather, that is, the old man's grandfather. Then we'll be able to know the features of the grandfather. We will come to know about the reply of the grandfather and the time period in which the grandfather lived. So, before we get into the lesson, let us have a quick brush up with what we saw in our last class. A grain as big as a hen's egg. So, first, we saw that a few children who were playing in a ravine found a thing that was strange. It looked like a grain of a corn, but it was huge as a hen's egg and had a cut in the middle. So a traveler who passed by gets it from the children and he sells it to the king. So then we see that the king calls his wise men and asks about it. And finally, the wise men finds out that it was nothing but a grain of a corn. Then the king asked the servants to bring the old peasants who would know about it. So we see that first a old peasant was brought who had two crutches and was half blind and deaf. So the old peasant did not know anything about the grain, so his father was brought again. So the father came with one crutch and was half deaf and couldn't recognize the grain too. So finally, at the end, we saw that the father tells the king that his father can be asked, he might know anything about the grain. So today we are going to see whether the king goes in search and gets the grandfather, that is, the grandfather of the first old peasant. So let's get into the lesson. So the king sent for this old man's father, and they found him too, and brought him before the king. He entered walking easily without crutches. His eyes were clear, his hearing good, and he spoke distinctly. The king showed him the grain, and the old grandfather looked at it and turned it about in his hand. So here, it is so surprising to see that the grandfather is also found by the servants and he is brought. And it says that the grandfather did not have any crutches, but he walked easily and came in. He could see well as hear well, and his voice was clear and gentle. So when the king shows the grain, the grandfather takes it in his hand and he has a look. So let's see whether he is able to recognize it. "It is long since I saw such a fine grain," said he, and he bit a piece off and tasted it. "It's the very same kind," he added. "Tell me, grandfather," said the king, "when and where was such corn grown? Have you ever brought any like it or sown any in your fields?" So what happens here? The grandfather, as he takes it in his hand, he also takes a bite and tells the king that it is the same grain that he had tasted before. So the king curiously asks about where and when such grain was found. So let's see what the grandfather replies. And the old man replied, corn like this used to grow everywhere in my time. I lived on corn like this in my young days and fed others on it. It was grain like this that we used to sow and reap and thresh. And the king asked, tell me, grandfather, did you buy it anywhere or did you grow it all yourself? So here the grandfather tells the king that during his time they had the same kind of corn, and from his childhood days he ate the corn and he fed others the same corn. So he also tells the king that they used such big grains to sow and they reaped the grains and they threshed the same grains. Threshing is nothing but separating the grain of corn from other. So finally the king asked about where they would buy such and such grain. The old man smiled. In my time, he answered, no one ever thought of such a sin as buying or selling bread, and we knew nothing of money. Each man had enough of his own. Then tell me, grandfather, asked the king, where was your field? Where did you grow corn like this? So here the grandfather smiles and tells the king that during his days they never used to buy or sell bread. They used to make them all by their own labor. And here also we see that during the grandfather's days they never had money, and we must notice the fact that buying and selling food items were considered a sin in those days. So finally the king asked where such kind of grain can be grown, like in which kind of a land it would be grown. And the grandfather answered, my field was God's earth. Wherever I plowed, there was my field. Land was free. It was a thing no man called his own. Labor was the only thing men called their own. So what do we see here? During the days of the grandfather, they didn't have separate fields which they owned. They just had the fields. Anybody could go anywhere, and they must plow the land and sow and reap, and they'll get the produce which they will consume eventually. So the land are considered to be God's earth, and the labor was only considered to be the men own thing. So here plowing means in olden days they used to make the land fertile using the equipments they had by digging up the whole land. So you see in the picture, right? The cows and the man are plowing the land. So after plowing, the land becomes like this. And this is where the people used to sow. And then after few days, it used to become a crop, and they will harvest it and they will consume their harvest. So the land was free for everybody, but when they got the harvest, it was called their own. Moving on, I have two more questions to ask you, said the king. The first is, why did the earth bear such grain then, and has ceased to do so now? The second is, why does your grandson walk with two crutches, your son with one, and you yourself with none? Your eyes are bright, your teeth sound, and your speech clear and pleasant to the ear. How have these things come about? So here the king put forth two questions before the grandfather. The first one is, the king asks why the earth has ceased giving, that is, stopped giving such a growth, that is, big grains now, because earlier it did, right? So the king questions why now it has stopped. Second question was that this grandfather looks healthy, but his son and his grandson had crutches, were half deaf or blind, they weren't able to walk properly, they needed help, right? But this grandfather was healthy. So the king wondered why it was all like this now, whereas it was different before. So let's see what is the grandfather's reply. The old man answered, these things are so because men have ceased to live by their own labor and have taken to depending on the labor of others. In the old times, men lived according to God's law. They had what was their own and did not covet what others had. So there we come to end. So what does the grandfather say? He tells that the things have all changed because during his days everybody lived on their own labor, that is, they did not want what others had. They were happy with what they had. And that is said to be the God's law. The grandfather says that as people started to covet on others' things, the land also ceased to give what was the best. And as a result, all the unhealthiness and the first fruits are not being reaped by us. So, what we come to know is we must never covet. That is, we must not want what others have. Like you see in the picture, you must be happy with what you have. So, that is all for our lesson, a grain as big as a hen's egg. So, what does the parable say? The meaning of the parable is nothing but it talks about the God's law. That is, we must be contented with what we have. That is, we must be happy with what we have, and we must not want what others have. When we don't covet, we will also have a happy life. So, this is what our lesson teaches about. So, I hope you are able to know about the king's questions, the king's reactions, the grandfather's replies, and finally, we were able to interpret and find out the meaning of the parable. So, what we learnt is we must never covet. So, I hope all of you enjoyed the lesson, right? So, kindly get into the GCR and fill in the Google Forms and the activity sheet that is put up for you students. And as a follow up, I want you to frame sentences for the following words. These are the words that we learned during the lesson, so they are new to you. So kindly go through the words again, know their meanings, and frame sentences on your own. So the 10 words are ravine, crutches, totter, pondered, plow, thresh, curiosity, sow, covet, and grew. So I hope you'll all do your homework honestly, right, students? So there we come to the end of a class. So thank you, students. Meet you in our next class.